Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked onto the stage at the Atlantic Security Forum with 3 network cameras fixed on the panel, a packed hall spilling beyond its seats, and the unmistakable confidence of someone who believed the microphone was about to confirm what she had already decided about herself and everyone sitting across from her. The organizers had placed Ocasio-Cortez and JD Vance on the same panel deliberately, and the audience knew exactly why, because nobody had come expecting polite academic disagreement when 2 political figures with completely different instincts about class, power, America, and the world were sitting a few feet apart under live television lights. Down in the front row sat a man from Ohio in his 30s who had driven there that morning, walking with the uneven step left by the part of his leg that had not come home from Romani, unnoticed by the people on stage and uninterested in becoming anybody's political symbol. He had not come looking for a partisan performance, and he had not come because he expected politicians to explain his life back to him, but he sat quietly with his hands resting near his knees and waited while the moderator finished the polished introductions. Then Ocasio-Cortez took the microphone, smiled slightly, announced that the country deserved honesty more than manners, and immediately made it clear that her definition of honesty was going to begin with JD Vance. She looked across the stage and called him a clueless man who had written a sad little book about poverty, gone to Yale, and transformed his biography into what she dismissed as a marketing campaign wearing a uniform, reducing an entire path through poverty, military service, education, and politics into a sneer designed to make the audience laugh before Vance ever answered. That alone would have been aggressive enough, but Ocasio-Cortez did not stop with Vance, because the real contempt in her opening appeared when she turned from attacking one opponent to mocking the Americans who listened to pickup truck radio somewhere between a church and a gun store, people she described as if geography, culture, and ordinary working lives were evidence of intellectual failure. She talked about people who supposedly treated passports as something belonging to other families, then positioned herself as the future of the country while describing Vance as a memory dressed up as a man selling nostalgia and grievance. It was not merely an argument that his politics were wrong. It was the far more revealing suggestion that large parts of the country lacked the sophistication required to understand the world, while she, by contrast, represented the people qualified to define its future. Down in the front row, the Ohio veteran did not protest or clap or perform outrage for a camera, but his hands folded together more tightly because he had just listened to a national political figure smile while describing people from places like his as the punchline. Ocasio-Cortez leaned back as though the opening had landed exactly where she intended, yet the applause never developed into the wave she seemed to expect, and that failure mattered because a political attack built around superiority becomes extremely fragile the moment the room refuses to reward it. Vance did not interrupt her, did not grimace for the cameras, and did not rush to defend himself with a competing biography, because reacting emotionally would have allowed her to control both the subject and the tempo. He simply waited while the scattered response faded, then allowed the silence to stretch just beyond comfort, long enough for the moderator to shift, and for the room to begin wondering whether he was going to answer at all. Only then did he lean toward the microphone and thank her, telling Ocasio-Cortez that what she had said was about the most honest thing he expected to hear all night. It was a controlled answer, almost mild, but the point was already obvious. Vance was not going to argue with the insult first. He was going to test the authority behind it. Ocasio-Cortez had called him clueless about the world, so Vance proposed something much less theatrical than trading insults, saying that they should leave that accusation on the table and determine which of them actually had trouble reading a map. There was no thick binder in front of him, no dramatic stack of documents, and no elaborate visual prop, only a single index card lying face down on his knee, and for the moment he did not even need to touch it. He began with Munich, asking Ocasio-Cortez whether she remembered attending the conference that February, appearing on a major international stage alongside governors and ambassadors, and presenting herself as someone prepared to speak seriously about global affairs. She answered that she remembered the event being weaponized by people like him, but Vance kept the question narrow, emphasizing that she had gone there voluntarily, had wanted to be treated as a serious leader, and had described herself as ready. Ocasio-Cortez accepted the premise immediately, insisting that she had been ready and declaring that she had never entered a room she was not prepared for, which gave Vance exactly the foundation he wanted without requiring him to manufacture anything. He repeated the point calmly so there could be no later retreat into claims that she had been exhausted, surprised, trapped, or unfairly cornered, because she had now confirmed in front of the same audience that she considered herself fully prepared for Munich. Then Vance moved to the small question first, not a complicated treaty provision, not an intelligence estimate, not some obscure historical dispute, but a basic geographic point that carried devastating force precisely because Ocasio-Cortez had spent her opening lecturing other Americans about their supposed ignorance of the world. At Munich, he reminded her, she had placed Venezuela below the equator, south of it, despite the fact that Venezuela and Caracas sit north of the equator, making the mistake neither subtle nor debatable. The first laughter moved quickly through the hall because nearly everybody understood the scale of the error instantly, and no specialist knowledge was required to recognize why the contradiction was so damaging. A woman who had just mocked Americans for supposedly learning about the world from pickup truck radio had managed, on an international stage, to put an entire country in the wrong half of the planet. That was what made the moment sting far more than any complicated policy rebuttal could have done, because Ocasio-Cortez had not been caught misunderstanding a disputed strategic doctrine where reasonable people could argue over interpretations, but on the kind of map distinction taught long before anyone earns the right to lecture a nation about geopolitical sophistication. Vance had not needed to call her stupid, reckless, uninformed, or fraudulent. He simply placed her own claim of preparation beside her own geographic error and allowed the contradiction to do work that a louder attack would have weakened. The laughter grew because the audience understood the irony without having it explained to them, and a man near the aisle tried unsuccessfully to cover his reaction while the room shifted away from the certainty Ocasio-Cortez had carried into her opening. She had called Vance clueless about the world, mocked the people who came from communities like his, and treated cosmopolitan confidence as proof of competence, only to be confronted with a mistake so elementary that the accusation began turning back toward her. For the first time that evening, the issue was no longer whether JD Vance could survive her attack, but whether Ocasio-Cortez could escape the standard she had just imposed on everyone else. Her jaw tightened, and instead of conceding the geographic mistake or allowing Vance to keep the argument centered on competence, Ocasio-Cortez did what she had done successfully in other confrontations. She changed the battlefield entirely. She pulled the microphone closer and reframed the exchange as an attack on a working-class woman of color, arguing that a single verbal mistake was being weaponized by a man who had supposedly spent his adult life receiving advantages from institutions and wealthy patrons. Yale had handed him a degree, she said. A publisher had handed him a book deal. A billionaire had handed him a Senate seat. And now he was performing a little quiz show because he could not tolerate seeing a woman who looked like her speak with authority. It was a familiar and powerful maneuver because instead of answering whether she had been wrong, she shifted the question toward who was permitted to challenge her and what motives could be assigned to the challenger. Within seconds, the discussion was no longer about Venezuela on a map, but about gender, race, power, and whether one mistake could be used to erase an entire political career. For a brief stretch, the maneuver worked because Ocasio-Cortez knew how to deliver that argument with force, and the accusation that powerful women are judged by harsher standards immediately changed the emotional temperature in the room. A reporter began writing quickly. A young woman in the third row who had laughed moments earlier looked down at her hands, and the audience experienced the old instinct to retreat from an accusation large enough to make answering the original point feel politically dangerous. Ocasio-Cortez insisted that the exchange had never really been about Venezuela, and instead concerned who was allowed to be considered intelligent and authoritative in America, placing Vance's criticism inside a much larger historical charge. For roughly 20 seconds, she had the current back, and if the exchange had remained only between her and Vance, the maneuver might have carried her farther because it converted a specific factual mistake into a moral accusation against the person pointing it out. But the next interruption did not come from JD Vance, and that was precisely why it became far harder for Ocasio-Cortez to dismiss. At the far end of the stage, a Democrat who had remained mostly quiet leaned toward his microphone and said he was going to make one point before returning to silence, identifying himself as someone who had voted with his party more often than not, and who had grown up in a steel town outside Youngstown. He described a father who worked on the line and a mother who cleaned offices at night, then turned directly toward Ocasio-Cortez and told her he would not sit there while she used the language of the working class as an escape hatch whenever political pressure closed in. He said she kept invoking working people as though the phrase were a password, while the people who actually turned the wrenches were being spoken for at fundraisers held in rooms they could never afford to enter. The blow landed differently because it did not come from the Republican she had already framed as the enemy, but from a Democrat claiming the very working class experience she had just tried to use as armor. And suddenly the room had permission to return to the original question because somebody from her own side had stripped away the easiest shield before Vance had even begun the larger argument waiting on the index card. The Democrats' intervention changed the temperature in the hall because Ocasio-Cortez could no longer dismiss the criticism as merely another Republican attack wrapped in resentment. Not when someone from her own side had just told her that working class identity was not a costume to be pulled on whenever the argument turned against her. He made the distinction brutal and simple. Some people actually live inside that word. Some people actually come from families where paychecks depend on factories, night shifts, tools, sore backs, and hours that do not care whether a camera is present, and those people do not get to use working class as a rhetorical shield whenever accountability arrives. The young woman in the third row who had looked down moments earlier lifted her eyes again. The reflexive hesitation in the room weakened, and the audience began to understand that the shield Ocasio-Cortez had reached for was no longer protecting the point underneath it. Down in the front row, the man from Ohio shifted slightly in his seat, still refusing to clap, still refusing to perform for anyone, but his jaw moved once as though he had heard a stranger say something about his own life that politicians usually flattened into slogans. Vance remained silent through all of it, because by then, the most damaging thing he could do was allow somebody else to make the argument Ocasio-Cortez had assumed only he would make. When the Democrat finished, Vance let the silence remain for another moment, took a slow drink of water, set the glass down, and returned to the microphone without trying to exploit the interruption theatrically. He said he would have let the geography mistake go, because mixing up a map under hot lights was not enough by itself to define a person, and he even made fun of one of his own past errors rather than pretending he had never misspoken. That mattered because he removed the easiest defense available to Ocasio-Cortez before she could use it again. This was not about ending a career over Venezuela, not about pretending politicians never make mistakes, and not about treating one bad answer as proof of permanent stupidity. The problem, Vance said, was that she had not merely made a geographic mistake. She had called him clueless about the world, meaning war, power, alliances, consequences, and the places where political language stops being television and starts becoming orders carried out by people who do not get to leave when the panel ends. His patience had been built around the expectation that she might recognize the scale of her own accusation and walk it back. But after she doubled down, There was no reason left to pretend the argument was still about a map. Then Vance finally turned over the index card resting on his knee and moved from the small contradiction to the larger one, returning to the same Munich conference and the question that mattered far more than whether Ocasio-Cortez knew which side of the equator Venezuela occupied. He reminded the room that she had been asked whether the United States should commit troops to defend Taiwan if China moved against it, a question no serious American leader can treat casually, because every word is heard not only by voters at home, but by allies, adversaries, military planners, and families who know that foreign policy ambiguity can become somebody else's deployment order. Vance told the audience he would read her answer word for word rather than paraphrase it, specifically so she could not later accuse him of twisting what she had said, and then he delivered the hesitation exactly as it had occurred, including the repeated and the absence of a direct position. The room did not laugh this time because the subject was too serious for laughter, and the contrast with the earlier geography exchange made the silence heavier rather than lighter. Ocasio-Cortez had presented herself as the future of American leadership, but when presented with one of the most consequential questions that future leaders may actually have to answer, the answer had dissolved into hesitation. Vance described it plainly as 5 ums and no position. Roughly 20 seconds of delay, followed by the hope that the country would never have to find out what the answer really was. And suddenly the earlier accusation of cluelessness looked less like confidence and more like projection. Ocasio-Cortez reached for the microphone quickly, calling his characterization a grotesque distortion of a serious and nuanced position on endless American war, and insisting that carefulness should not be confused with ignorance. She argued that some people actually think before sending other people's children to die, a line meant to recover the moral advantage by putting restraint on one side and recklessness on the other. But that sentence hit the wrong target, because she had said it directly to a man who had once been one of those children sent into an American war, and the tone of Vance's response changed immediately. The warmth left his voice. The sarcasm disappeared, and what remained was colder precisely because he no longer needed to decorate the point. Vance told her that respect had existed 40 minutes earlier, before she had looked at Americans who fixed cars, framed houses, poured concrete, listened to local radio, lived near churches and gun stores, and treated those markers of ordinary life as evidence that they were too unsophisticated to understand the world. He said he had sat at those kitchen tables because he had been raised at one of them, and that the people Ocasio-Cortez had casually mocked understood the world perfectly well, only through a harder education than conferences and international panels usually provide. Then he addressed the subject she had chosen when she invoked other people's children, making clear that this was one area where she could not casually assign him the role of the uninformed outsider. Vance said he went to Iraq in 2005 as a Marine, and the room became completely still because the argument had crossed out of the territory of resume comparisons and into lived consequences. He did not wave the service around as a credential to end debate, and that restraint gave the point more force than any chest-thumping display could have. He said he was not going to give the audience the names of the men he thought about because they were not props for a panel, and that sentence cut against the entire political habit of using sacrifice as scenery for speeches designed to win applause. The men he remembered did not get to run for office, perform live streams, explain away a difficult question, or complain afterward that the framing had been unfair, and Vance refused to turn them into supporting characters for his own argument. What he did say was that hesitation from a leader on whether the United States would defend an ally carried weight outside the conference hall, because uncertainty spoken from a stage could become danger borne by somebody much younger who would never be invited to that stage in the first place. His voice dropped as he said he had watched men carry that weight and had helped carry one of them, and down in the front row, The Ohio veteran lowered his head for a moment. That reaction did not need commentary because the room understood exactly why a sentence about carrying somebody could land differently on a man who had left part of himself overseas. Vance's point was not that every difficult foreign policy question required a reckless instant answer, nor did he claim that caution itself was weakness. His argument was that somebody who mocked an entire class of Americans for supposedly failing to understand the world had better show more than verbal fog when the world finally asked something serious in return. He told Ocasio-Cortez that some people counted those 20 seconds in a different kind of room than the one where she had spoken them, because for soldiers and their families, the abstract language of strategy eventually turns into names, orders, flights, wounds, and empty chairs. Then he drew the distinction that cut directly through the self-image she had carried onto the stage. A conference about the world is not the world, and the people who succeed inside the first should be very careful before assuming that success makes them masters of the second. Ocasio-Cortez had presented her international credentials as proof that Vance's worldview was provincial, but Vance's counter-argument was that flying to a conference and speaking before cameras did not automatically confer the judgment required when consequences arrive without applause. The insult had now reversed itself almost completely, because the issue was no longer whether he had seen enough of the world to speak, but whether she had confused access to elite rooms with command of what happens outside them. Vance then returned to the aftermath of Munich, not to introduce a new controversy, but to show that the problem did not end when the panel ended, because criticism of Ocasio-Cortez had come from Democratic strategists and foreign policy figures, as well as Republicans. He cited one assessment from her own side describing a complete lack of chops on international issues, deliberately emphasizing that this was not his language and not evidence produced by a conservative opponent looking for a clip. That detail mattered because Ocasio-Cortez had spent much of the exchange trying to make the criticism about who was criticizing her, but criticism coming from inside her own political camp made that escape increasingly difficult. Vance laid the card down and allowed the point to sit without embellishment, making the pattern visible through sequence rather than volume. First came the mistake, then the strategic question, then the hesitation, and then criticism from people who had every partisan incentive to protect rather than embarrass her. After Munich, Vance continued, Ocasio-Cortez went on a late-night live stream to explain what had happened, and instead of conceding that the answer had been weak, she argued that the real problem was an American political culture accustomed to a president who spoke without thinking. That response, in Vance's framing, revealed more than the original hesitation because it converted a failure to answer into an accusation against everyone who had expected an answer in the first place. She had been asked one question about the world, struggled to answer it, and then explained the struggle by suggesting that the audience's expectation itself was part of the problem. The hall broke into a much larger laugh than before, not because Taiwan or military commitments were funny, but because the contradiction was now impossible to miss once the explanation was placed beside the original performance. The man from Ohio shook his head with a grin, and the room that had spent the opening being told which Americans were sophisticated enough to understand the world was now watching sophistication collapse under the weight of its own excuses. Ocasio-Cortez tried to answer again, but Vance lifted one hand just enough to hold the floor because he had not yet finished showing the pattern, and the next part moved away from Munich toward the working-class identity she had repeatedly invoked whenever the argument became uncomfortable. He said she had a habit of putting on the working class like a coat when the cameras came on and taking it off when they went dark, returning directly to the accusation the Democrat had already made from the other end of the stage. The room was no longer reacting to an isolated factual slip, and that was the entire point Vance had been building toward from the beginning, because a single mistake can be forgiven while a repeated contradiction between rhetoric and conduct is harder to dismiss. Ocasio-Cortez had entered the evening believing she could define who understood the world, who represented ordinary Americans, who had earned authority, and who was merely performing an outdated memory of the country. Vance was now preparing to test that claim against her own words about the heartland, the protection around her when she delivered them, and the campaign money spent in the name of the very people she insisted only she truly understood. Vance did not change direction because the argument about working-class authenticity was no longer a side issue, and Ocasio-Cortez herself had made it central from the opening minute when she mocked Americans whose lives revolved around pickup trucks, churches, gun stores, local radio, and towns far removed from the rooms where international conferences manufacture their own version of seriousness. He reminded the audience that earlier that spring she had stood at a rally and told the North to pull up on the South, calling out Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee in language that sounded less like persuasion than a summons to political combat, as though the people living in those states were obstacles to be confronted rather than citizens to be convinced. Then Vance added the detail that made the line cut harder, pointing out that she had delivered that challenge from behind bulletproof glass, protected from the same public tensions she was rhetorically urging other people to enter. The contradiction was impossible to dress up with another speech about class because it was visible on its face. Ocasio-Cortez could summon ordinary people toward confrontation while standing behind protection they would never have, then return to Washington and still claim exclusive ownership over the language of courage. Vance did not need to dramatize the glass because the image already carried enough contempt on its own, a politician telling the heartland to charge while remaining physically separated from the consequences of the charge. He told her that people back home noticed those things, not because they were obsessed with political theater, but because working people develop an instinct for spotting the distance between what somebody says and what somebody is willing to risk personally. They noticed when politicians used words like sacrifice, struggle, solidarity, and working class from spaces ordinary families could never afford to enter. And they noticed when those same politicians treated their own comfort as non-negotiable while treating everybody else's discomfort as evidence of moral seriousness. Vance's point was not that public officials should refuse security or expose themselves recklessly, but that someone should think twice before using protected stages to lecture unprotected people about how much more they ought to confront in the name of a politics being designed somewhere else. That distinction mattered because Ocasio-Cortez had built the entire evening around the idea that Vance was detached from the real world while she represented the people living closest to it. Now, the evidence being placed against that claim was not coming from some philosophical disagreement, but from the simple contrast between what she demanded from others and the conditions under which she made those demands. Then Vance moved to the campaign spending, saying that reporting from the same season showed more than $50,000 in campaign money spent on luxury hotels, money connected to donors who often gave in $10 and $20 increments because they believed the working class message being sold to them. That number changed the tone again because campaign rhetoric about ordinary people becomes harder to treat as sacred when the money supplied by those same ordinary people is being connected to accommodations far outside the financial reality of the donors writing the checks. Vance framed the contradiction without pretending that politicians should sleep on park benches, because the point was not that a campaign could never pay for lodging, but that Ocasio-Cortez had made austerity, solidarity, and moral identification with struggling families part of her political identity. If you build your authority by insisting that you uniquely understand rent, wages, insecurity, long shifts, and household pressure, then every luxurious choice funded through political contributions becomes more politically revealing than it would be for someone who never wrapped himself in that claim. Vance said he was not the person who had lost the plot on the working class because he had never claimed to be its only legitimate voice, while Ocasio-Cortez repeatedly had. By then, the pattern Vance had been constructing was brutally clear because each piece reinforced the next without requiring him to inflate any single mistake into more than it was. Ocasio-Cortez had placed Venezuela in the wrong hemisphere, struggled through the Taiwan question, blamed the expectation of an answer on the people asking, summoned red states toward political confrontation from behind protective glass, and stood accused of spending substantial campaign money on luxury hotels funded by donors she described as the very people whose lives gave her politics moral authority. None of those points needed to be converted into a separate scandal, because Vance's argument was cumulative and simpler than that. Someone who walks onto a stage calling other people clueless should be prepared for the possibility that her own record will be placed beside the insult. The laughter and murmurs moving through the hall no longer sounded like a crowd enjoying a clever comeback, because the room had started recognizing the shape of a contradiction that had been present from the beginning. Ocasio-Cortez had tried to establish superiority through identity, geography, education, class language, and international exposure, while Vance kept dragging the discussion back to whether those things had produced judgment strong enough to support the certainty with which she dismissed everyone else. But Ocasio-Cortez did not retreat, and to her credit, she finally answered with the part of her biography that carried real weight rather than another attempt to shift the subject away from the record Vance was laying out. She pulled the microphone close, straightened in her chair, and challenged him directly on where they had come from, reminding the hall that she had entered public life after working behind a bar, making cocktails, clearing tables, and spending 10-hour shifts on her feet, while men like Vance were being mentored at Yale by people with access to institutions she had never inherited. Her argument was no longer abstract, because this time she was not speaking about the working class as a category floating above the room, but about labor she herself had performed, and the difference could be felt immediately. Ocasio-Cortez said she had learned the country from the floor of it, not from a memoir about the floor, not through a later interpretation of hardship turned into a political brand, but by working inside the exhausting rhythm of service labor before the cameras ever arrived. She accused Vance of studying struggle from a safe distance and then packaging the study as wisdom, while she claimed the experience of surviving the conditions he had turned into analysis. She reminded the audience that voters in her district had chosen her repeatedly and emphasized that she represented one of the most diverse districts in the country, arguing that those voters had more authority to judge whether she understood their lives than a hostile opponent sitting across from her on a stage. Then she turned the accusation back toward Vance, describing his gravity as borrowed and his position as something enabled by the exact political and institutional networks he had accused her of misunderstanding. For a moment, the room moved slightly back in her direction because this was a stronger argument than calling the geography question sexist or turning every factual challenge into proof that someone resented her identity. The experience of working long service shifts was real within the script's own frame. The pride attached to it was understandable, and Ocasio-Cortez delivered it with enough force that even people who had laughed earlier stopped treating the exchange like an easy collapse. She had finally reached for something Vance could not dismiss without looking dishonest, and he knew it. Vance waited until she finished completely before answering, and when he did not attack the bartending story, mock service work, or pretend that her climb into Congress had required nothing from her. He told Ocasio-Cortez that nobody on the stage was reducing her life, that coming up from behind a bar and building something real deserved respect, and that he would shake her hand for it in any parking lot in America. The concession was important because it stripped away the easiest defense once again. Vance was not denying her past, and he was not claiming that only his hardship counted while hers was fake. What he denied was her attempt to use that past as permanent immunity from scrutiny, because surviving difficult circumstances does not automatically make every later judgment correct, and does not erase contradictions between rhetoric and conduct. He told her plainly that her biography was not what was on trial that night, and with that sentence the argument snapped back to the place she had been trying to leave. What was on trial, Vance said, was the record already sitting between them, because she had stood on an international stage and failed a basic geographic point, then faced the kind of strategic question leaders are expected to understand and could not produce a direct answer. He reminded her that when criticism followed, including criticism from people within her own political side, she had not responded with humility, but with an explanation that made the expectation itself sound unreasonable. The problem was not that Ocasio-Cortez had once been a bartender, just as the problem was not that Vance had gone to Yale, written a book, entered politics, or used his biography as part of his public identity. The problem was that she had walked into the Atlantic Security Forum certain enough of her authority to call another person clueless about the world, while simultaneously carrying a record that raised obvious questions about the very competence she was using as a weapon. Vance kept his voice low, because by then volume would only have weakened the contrast between her opening certainty and the facts he had spent the night placing beside it. He set the index card down face up on the small table between them where the camera could see it, turning the single piece of paper into a quiet symbol of how little material had been required to dismantle the argument she had arrived prepared to make. He told Ocasio-Cortez that she had stood before the world and could not identify which half of the planet a country occupied, that she had not answered the one question every serious leader eventually has to face, and that afterward she blamed the world for expecting clarity. He did not call her stupid, because stupidity was never the accusation he needed, and he did not call her a fraud, because the point had already become harsher than any name he could attach to her. Vance said she had not merely run out of an answer in Munich, she had run out of the humility required to admit that she had never possessed one, and that was the quality he identified as clueless on the stage. Then he finished the thought by reminding her that whatever else could be said about the exchange, the clueless person in that moment was not the Marine sitting across from her. The sentence landed without the theatrical explosion Ocasio-Cortez had probably prepared herself to fight, because Vance had denied her the kind of insult she could easily turn into another argument about prejudice, resentment, or personal hatred. He had instead taken her own language, her own Munich performance, her own explanation afterward, and her own claims about the working class, then placed them close enough together that the contradictions no longer required interpretation. Ocasio-Cortez looked down at the pen in her hand, and the cameras caught how tightly her fingers had closed around it, while the room waited for the next response everyone assumed would come. She had spent years building a political style around the certainty that another sentence could always regain control of the argument, that speed and conviction could overwhelm whatever had been placed in front of her before the audience had time to examine it. This time, the room waited. The index card remained face up between them. Vance stopped talking, and for the first time that night, Ocasio-Cortez had nothing immediate to put between herself and the silence. The silence did not arrive all at once. It settled over the hall in layers, first as hesitation, then as expectation, and finally as the uncomfortable recognition that Ocasio-Cortez was not reaching for the microphone, because no immediate answer had survived the argument placed in front of her. Her thumb had been pressed hard against the pen for nearly a minute, the small object turning in her grip while the cameras stayed fixed on the stage, and the pressure in her hand became more revealing than another speech would have been, because it showed a person accustomed to controlling rooms suddenly searching for something to hold on to. She had built her public style around speed, around producing the next sentence before the previous challenge could settle, around turning every accusation into a larger accusation and every factual dispute into a fight over motives, identity, power, or historical grievance. But Vance had refused to chase any of those exits, and the index card sitting face up between them had reduced the entire night to a sequence she could not talk around without returning to the very facts she had spent the evening trying to outrun. Then the pen slipped the final fraction of an inch through her fingers and fell. It struck the hardwood stage and bounced once, a small plastic knock carried clearly through the floor microphones because the room had become quiet enough for something that ordinary to sound enormous. Ocasio-Cortez looked down at it, but she did not reach for it, and that simple refusal gave the moment more force than any gesture designed for television, because the woman who had entered the forum attacking Vance as a relic had suddenly been reduced to staring at an object lying between her shoes. She folded her hands in her lap. No microphone movement, no rapid rebuttal, no fresh accusation about who was allowed to speak with authority, no attempt to rescue Munich by changing the subject again. The moderator waited a moment and gently asked whether the congresswoman wished to respond, giving her the cleanest opening possible to reclaim the floor if she wanted it. Ocasio-Cortez did not respond. That silence mattered because it was not the silence of someone denied time, shouted over, cut off, or ambushed before she could finish. She had been given room repeatedly, had delivered long arguments, had challenged Vance's biography, his motives, his education, his political rise, and his right to lecture her about the world. She had accused him of benefiting from Yale, publishers, billionaires, and institutions, had reframed criticism of her map error as part of a larger attack on women like her, and had defended her authority by reaching back to the years she spent working behind a bar. Vance had answered by conceding the parts of her biography that deserved respect and then returning to the question she could not permanently escape: whether the certainty with which she dismissed everyone else was supported by her own performance when the subject became serious. By the end, he did not have to call her incompetent, because the argument was harsher when he simply put her own confidence beside her own record and stopped talking. The pen hitting the floor became the last sound before the moderator's question, precisely because there was no more rhetorical cover left to place between Ocasio-Cortez and that contradiction. The man from Ohio in the front row watched the exchange end without turning himself into part of the spectacle, just as he had watched the rest of the night without asking the cameras to notice what he had carried into the room. He had listened at the beginning while people from places like his were treated as provincial, intellectually limited, and politically useful only when someone needed a symbol of grievance. And he had sat still while Ocasio-Cortez described pickup truck radio in small-town America as evidence of people who supposedly did not understand the world. Then he had listened while Vance spoke about Iraq, about leaders whose hesitation carries weight somewhere far from the conference stage, about the men who do not get microphones afterward, and about the difference between talking about war and living inside its consequences. The Ohio veteran had lowered his head when Vance spoke about helping carry one of those men, because there are sentences that hit differently when part of your own body never came home with you. Now, with the pen still on the stage and the room waiting for an answer that did not come, he had watched the entire argument return to the people Ocasio-Cortez had mocked before Vance ever touched the index card. The night ended without some grand declaration because none was necessary, and Vance did not linger on stage waiting for applause to certify the point he had already made. He slid the index card back into his jacket pocket, shook two hands, and moved toward the exit while cameras called after him, leaving behind the chair, the stage, and the aftermath of an exchange that had begun with Ocasio-Cortez presenting herself as the future and Vance as a memory. That contrast had been her chosen frame, not his, and by the end it had collapsed because the supposedly outdated Marine had spent the evening forcing the self-proclaimed future to answer questions grounded in her own words, rather than in the image she preferred to project. He had entered with one card, never needed a stack of folders, never needed a theatrical pile of evidence, and never needed to invent anything beyond what she had already said and done in the sequence being discussed. The power of the confrontation came from how little he had to add. The man from Ohio drove back that night on the long interstate, the road unwinding through darkness while the forum disappeared behind him and the argument stayed in his head. He did not need a commentator to explain why the exchange had mattered, because the insult that opened the evening had been aimed at people whose lives resembled his long before it ever became a personal argument between two politicians on a stage. Ocasio-Cortez had treated towns like his as cultural evidence for why some Americans supposedly could not understand the world, but the man driving home had already paid a price for that world that no panel credential could imitate. Somewhere beyond the state line, the memory that remained was not a polished line from a campaign speech or a carefully designed moment of applause, but the tiny sound of a pen bouncing once against hardwood after the certainty had finally run out. He laughed alone in the cab, because sometimes the smallest sound tells you more about a political argument than another 1,000 words ever could. Vance left the forum the same way he had conducted most of the exchange, without waiting for somebody else to announce that he had won, because his method had been to make Ocasio-Cortez defend the standard she herself introduced. She called him clueless about the world, so he tested the claim against Munich. She defended herself through identity and class, so a Democrat from Youngstown challenged her ownership of the working class label. She invoked the danger of sending other people's children to war, so the Marine across from her explained what those consequences look like outside political language. She answered criticism with biography, and Vance acknowledged the biography before returning to competence, humility, and whether a leader who expects authority can admit when she does not know something. At every stage the argument became harder for her, not because he kept inventing new accusations, but because the original accusation kept coming back in a different form. By the end, the question was no longer whether Vance was clueless. It was why Ocasio-Cortez had been so eager to use that word before examining how easily her own record could be placed underneath it. That is why the final silence carried more weight than another round of shouting ever could have carried, because shouting would have allowed both sides to leave, claiming they had merely talked past one another. Silence left the facts sitting where they had been placed. Venezuela, north of the equator, the Taiwan answer full of hesitation, the criticism from inside her own political side, the rhetoric about red states delivered from behind protective glass, the luxury hotel spending, and the working class defense she believed could answer all of it at once. Vance did not need to tell the audience what conclusion to reach about every item, because the cumulative contradiction had already become the conclusion. Ocasio-Cortez had walked into the Atlantic Security Forum certain that she could define who understood the world and who merely pretended to, and she left after discovering that confidence is not the same thing as command. The world, inconveniently for anyone who mistakes a microphone for mastery, eventually asks questions back. If this exchange made you sit up even once, hit the like button so more people who are tired of being dismissed as clueless get a chance to see what happened when that accusation was finally tested instead of merely repeated. If you believe ordinary Americans from Ohio, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and every other place politicians use as shorthand deserve more respect than a sneer about pickup trucks and radio stations, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Leave one word in the comments, 20, because those 20 seconds in Munich became the hinge on which the entire night turned from confidence into accountability. Share this with someone who understands that a town is not a punchline, a working life is not evidence of ignorance, and military service is not a costume worn for a conference. Ocasio-Cortez flew over the world she claimed Vance did not understand. Vance had walked through part of it as a Marine, and on that stage, her own words finally forced the difference into the open.